It's a pleasure being here in São Paulo. Sometimes we go outside our own countries and we start our lecture saying, I don't speak French, or I don't speak Germany, or I don't speak Chinese, but today I can say I speak Portuguese. É um enorme prazer estar com vocês, voltar a São Paulo. Estive aqui com os meus pais quando eu tinha 18 anos ou 19 anos. I think I was on the first year of my architectural studies in Lisbon. Thank you so much, Gabriela, for this invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to share with you some of research that I did for my PhD. It's going to be a long story. Can you hear me well? Ouve-me bem? Okay. It's going to be a long way that I'm going to try to show you in 15 minutes. And if you have any questions, just please raise your hand and try to break the law. I will have a kind of four-part presentation, since I'm trying to highlight a kind of intellectual history from the big moments or important moments that shaped a few ideas and a few technological artifacts for this wonderful world that we are always working with. So the title of the talk puts the war kind of epicenter. So I thought it was probably interesting to understand what was going on before the war. So I call it pre-war. Then the second part speaks about avant-garde. Avant-garde meanings the new ideas in physics and art that shaped a new intellectual idea that helped architects to put forward some research agendas. This is very much centered in the United Kingdom. Then we move on to the technological computing and finally architectural codes. The driving force that I had by then, when I was at MIT with Gabby, and even now today, was trying to see that computation and software development have been augmenting the practice of architecture, as we saw already here in the previous lecture, and of its relation to the process of digital design and construction. However, I thought that the lack of a plural view of the recent history of architecture related to the field of computing and to its intellectual history compelled us to draw an initial historical background, allowing for a broader perspective of the dawn of computing in architecture. Some of the issues raised before also are raised in Portugal, sometimes also in the US, in Italy, in Spain. There is a certain resistance from traditional fields of teaching to architecture, and I guess part of that resistance comes from we still don't have a broader view of the intellectual, cultural, and political history that shapes technological artifacts. So the question that I put to myself and I try to answer this presentation are, for instance, which was the cultural, political, and technological context that fostered the emergence of computing within architecture. And we need to differentiate here building science and then architecture. Okay. And which were the main centers, research centers or faculties or universities that promoted this new agenda? Why did they appear? Who were the pioneers? I saw already a few of them here. And how influential was their research for the development of the field? Well, as you know, World War II witnessed the suffering and the death of millions of people, of lives, from both sides of the conflict. But both tried to acquire new technological war artifacts, from new jet airplanes to more powerful machine guns, to new radar equipment, wireless intelligence, cryptographic machines, and new computing power. We look at this period trying to understand how architects would start to mediate the use of the technological war of spring. We believe that a series of interesting events and people promoted pioneer ideas that fostered later the development of a sustainable program of integrated research between the building science, architecture, and the new advancements in the field of computing. This image is very keen to me because anytime I do research, I arrive to this place. I don't know if any of you know this picture. Any? No? So this picture was taken by Lee Miller. Lee Miller was a model and a photographer, probably one of the best photographers of the 20th century. She studied with Man Ray. She was Man Ray's lover, and then she got married with Roland Penrose. Roland Penrose was a wealthy guy from Cambridge in the UK, and he became the first director of the ICA and the Tate Gallery. This is the backyard of their home in London, Hampstead, and it depicts already two things. The notion of art and the notion of camouflage and the notion of war shelters. They digged kind of a hole on their garden to protect in case of a European attacks during the World War. However, if you can go back a little bit, you remember that the important event preceded the Second World War, and that it was the Spanish Civil War that took place between 1936 and 1939 between the Republicans and General Franco National Army. Despite international attention that the Spanish conflict started to receive, 27 countries ratified the non-intervention agreement signed by the French and the British governments in 1936. This treaty effectively subjected the Spanish Republic to a global isolation and was considered by many social groups as a betrayal of the Spanish people. This encouraged the presence of international writers, journalists, photographers, artists, architects in Spain during the period, whose work aimed to combat the lack of acknowledgement of the conflict in Europe, and in particular in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you remember, but the famous American writer Ernest Hemingway was one of the first to be in Spain. He was invited to cover the war as correspondent for the North American newspaper Alliance. In that year, Hemingway also worked with the Dutch movie director Joey Ivans on the making of the documentary film The Spanish Earth. You can see the poster on the left. And this film was narrated by Orson Welles, which aim was to gather American support for the Spanish loyalist cause, which was under siege by General Franco. Hemingway's experience at the war front also formed the basis for his novel, for which he won the Nobel Prize, For Whom the Bell Tolls, which paid tribute to the Spanish people fighting for freedom and social justice. Nevertheless, also George Orwell went to fight at the Spanish Civil War at the international brigades, and he wrote homage to Catalonia, documenting and depicting the suffering of the war to a great British audience. The events in Spain became thus at the forefront of discussion of the British avant-garde, also due to Leslie Martin, awareness of the conflict. By this time, Leslie Martin, as you know, with Lionel March, founded in 1967 the Land Use and Built Form Studies in Cambridge, was concluding his PhD thesis, which title was, or is, The Position of José de Churriguera in the Development of Spanish Baroque Architecture. Leslie Martin and his wife, Sadie Spite, were starting to get involved with various scientific and artistic communities in the UK in order to help the Spanish refugees. Nonetheless, magazines such as The View magazine, Life magazines in regards, started to add the first photos of the war. Once again, Lee Miller, Margaret Bourke-White, Robert Capa, and young Jewish-German photographer Gilles Dataro became world-known due to their photo reportage during the Spanish Civil War. These two photo covers portray images from Gilles Dataro and Robert Capa. As you know, they were a couple and they worked together. Unfortunately, Gilles Dataro died in Spain in a war accident. So this melting pot of events forced Roland Penrose. You can see Roland Penrose on the left, nearby Pablo Picasso on the window of the Pablo Picasso car. They were in France and they went to Spain by two main reasons. The first of all, since Penrose was very anxious to make this call about the danger of fascism that could arrive to the UK, he wanted to bring Picasso's Guernica painting to London. And you can see on the other picture, Lee Miller, Picasso, and Dora Maar, which was Picasso's girlfriend. And indeed, they succeed. The catalogue of the Guernica exhibition in London, which painting was exhibited, as you know, in 1937 for the first time at Universal Exposition in Paris, and which pavilion was designed by the Catalan architect Louis Sert. These two images here display on the left Clement Attlee, which was the leader of the Labour Party and further Prime Minister in the UK, and an ardent supporter of the International Brigade, presents Picasso's painting together in Penrose, London. The exhibition was a success, bringing to the public attention the danger of fascism and fostering a global awareness for the lack of civilian and governmental defenses that Britain would face in case of a large European conflict. So, on one hand, we had a kind of a public opinion that said we need to help Spanish people because the government was not doing that due to the treaty design. But on the other hand, they were thinking about if the conflict arrives to Britain, do we have the civil defense to prevent from an aerial attack? Which is the engineering and technological outfit that we have to prevent from that possibility, as you know, that started to happen at the end of 1939. So the painting of Picasso here is has a twofold meaning. It represents the atrocities of the war. It represents, for the first time, the danger of fascism. We're talking about Mussolini and Hitler, and trying to open the awareness of the British community to that political scenario. And in fact, this dreadful moment was a kind of a catalysis to put together, and that's my hypothesis, in a very convinced way, architects, engineers, scientists to work on this belief, to do research to prevent England to suffer from the war. To overcome the situation, scientists from different fields started to conduct rigorous surveys of the logistics of civil defense and produce forecasts of the level of destruction that cities would face in the event of war. In the spring of 1937, the Cambridge Scientific Anti-War Group, which Desmond Brunel was the chief, published a small booklet, you can see here the cover, which was a seminal work and book for further collaborative research. At the same time, Leslie Martin and the constructivist Russian artist Nabokov, who had fled from Germany, published Circle, an important manifesto for multidisciplinary work with articles from the physicist Desmond Brunel, from architects like Marcel Breuer, Walter Gropius, Wally Nagy, and many others. These two publications, I believe, put together kind of a new intellectual consciousness about the idea, that's why I call it avant-garde, to produce new works of art, to produce multidisciplinary research, either for architecture or as a scientific output in the case of work. There are very interesting booklets. For instance, you can see these two plans for art, and you see Sergei Chermayev, which was as well a Russian architect who was living in London by a certain time, and Chermayev was the PhD advisor of Christoph Alexander, who worked with Leslie Martin as well. And so you have Desmond Brunel, a physicist, Professor Haldane, and Sergei Chermayev doing this booklet, and as well plain art. It was also kind of a report organized by a Tecton firm. Tecton firm, as you know, was the firm that Bertolt Lupkin created in London, and he worked with Overhoop. The presence of the engineer Overhoop in London it's a masterpiece. Since very few people by then, we're talking about 1933, 1932, very few people in UK knew how to work with concrete. Well, Corbusier already displayed that 10 years before, but in London nobody knew very much. So Overhoop was working for a naval and civil engineer company, a Danish company called Christian Nielsen, and they were building arbors, and arbors in concrete. So it was a kind of being on the right place, on the right moment. So this partnership between architects and engineers by Overhoop was a kind of a major breakthrough in bringing these two kind of different intelligences to a major goal. You might have seen already these pictures, of course, but there are something here that I would like to show to you. This is the construction that Arup and Bertolt Lupkin did for the London Zoo, but there is an interesting coincidence here. During the 30s, Julian Huxley was the director of the London Zoological Society, and he asked Lupkin to design the new zoo gorilla house for the London Zoo, as well the penguin pool, portrayed here with the concrete picture. His brother was the writer Aldous Huxley, and his nephew was Andrew Huxley, one of the pioneers to do research about the electric circuitry of the nervous systems. In fact, Andrew Huxley, with Professor Hodgkin, studied the nerve systems and synapses of large squids in order to propose the mathematical description of the action potential of the nerve cells, becoming thus a pioneer of information theory and cybernetics. We know that Claude Shannon at MIT wrote his master's thesis in 1948 about this, but we're talking about here 1932. Unfortunately, the war, this paper was not published, it was published a little bit later. But the Huxley family and the grandfather of Huxley was a colleague of Darwin. So it's interesting that they almost feature all spectrum of the intellect, from biology, writing, science, and the architect Omar Lupkin were at the epicenter of this new enterprise. But let me highlight two small articles that you can do research after. I'm putting here kind of hypothesis that the agenda that Leslie Martin and Lionel March so beautifully put out in 1967 was very much informed and influenced by this physicist, Desmond Burnell. If you take a closer look to the writings of 1937, he has this beautiful text, Architecture and Science, which was published in the Royal Institute of British Architects. So we have a physicist writing in the Journal of Architects. I do not know if we have architects writing on the Journal of the Physicists by then, but he writes beautifully about the relation of architecture and science. And 10 years later, there is a special review issue of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Science and the Architect, and the person who is invited to supervise or to be the editor of the review is once again Desmond Burnell. The difference is that 10 years later, Leslie Martin writes a piece and Burnell supervises the thing. I'm just going to quote here, this is from the 1937 text. The academic architect and the academic scientist were poles apart. The result has been unhappy for both sides. The essential superficiality that marked the decay of architecture in the 19th century and still marks school architecture today is due to a preoccupation with the appearance rather than structure. Another interesting document that tried to reinforce this hypothesis here is that in 1939, okay, so just at the beginning of the wartime, Leslie Martin had concluded his PhD thesis, and he takes a position that at the Hull School of Architecture. Hull is located east side of London, like 100 kilometers away. The interesting thing that he organized this congress and invites many of his friends. He invites everyone that wrote with him the Circle book in 1937. And once again, he invites Desmond Burnell and Sergei Chermayev to speak about the challenge of science and technology within architecture. The manuscript of Burnell, which is 8 pages long, is beautifully written, typewritten, and I'm going to quote what Burnell said to that audience, where Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer were there as well, said, what I'm going to do is to sketch the part that scientific research has to play in this general program for architecture. For the architect to go outside the tradition of architecture and to find out what has been done in techniques. Anytime we read this, it applies to nowadays today, but I think it's quite interesting how a person can write this in such a clear and sparkling way in 1939. I don't want you to bother with more documents, but there are several letters written to Burnell from the RIBA and from the Journal of Architects, trying to address this new architectural science board that was formed by then. So between 1938 and 1942, several committees and scientific groups were formed in London, always to try to make a research agenda. Also why? Because they were preventing the war, and they knew that if the war took place, there would be the need to redesign the cities, to do urban planning, to design new schools, to design new hospitals. That's why the computational agenda after the war is so different between UK and US, for instance. closer look here, there are several committees: economics, sociology, master planning, architecture. Once again, with the guy who supervises everything, with the physicist, and Leslie Martin is within one of these groups. So this kind of, I don't want to be a lawyer here, but I think this kind of documents display a very intense communication between these people, between their wives, between the environment. And Leslie Martin was a very gentle and noble person, very intelligent, and I think he was absorbing all these till 1967 when we have now then the computing power to lay this group. Once again, if you take a closer look to these documents, the organization of the building science research in 1946, and once again the letters to him by the Royal Institute of British Architects commenting on the programs of research in the UK where once again architects and physicists work together. At the end of the day, we have this kind of science at war, which compiles, organizes almost 10 years of sparkling or better organized discussions and conclusions of the place of science and architecture in case of war. However, there is another paradigm, and I call it avant-garde. So the avant-garde, so if the war was a kind of intellectual glue necessary to put these people talking, the art and science played a very important role as well, because everything needed to be new, and architects and artists wanted to produce a new work. This is the view of the city of Ulm at the first volume of the Civitatis Orbis Terrarum, published in Cologne in 1572, and as you know, edited by George Brown. At the city, Ulm, Albert Einstein was born in 1879, and decades later, the city would remember this by associating the motto Ulmensis sum mathematici, the people of Ulm are mathematical. One of the most significant design schools since the end of the World War was precisely the Hochschule für Gestaltung, which was founded in Ulm, and during its existence from 1953 to 1968, its three directors, the Swiss architect Max Bill, the Argentinian painter Tomás Maldonado, and the German philosopher Max Benz, pioneered a new pedagogical curriculum that inaugurated an academic discourse for the relation between science, logic, and architecture. This school inaugurated an innovative pedagogy, and distinguished faculty members launched analogical methods of design thinking that can be seen today as the basis for further computational approach in architecture. But Einstein, as you know, was responsible for one of the major breakthroughs in physics at the turn of the century, his theory of special relativity in 1905, and also Max Planck's theory that electromagnetic energy could be emitted only in quantized units, let's say a small package of energy, quantum theory, revolutionized the understanding of atomic and subatomic processes, as well the understanding about space and time. At the end of the 20s, modern quantum theory emerged as a new science paradigm. In October 1927, leading physicists as Einstein, Bohr, Planck met at the Solvay International Conference, where you can see here the picture. Why is this important? That by that time, the paradigm of space and time encounters also an echo in the arts. The discovery of the collection of models of ruled surfaces at the Science and Art Department at South Kensington Museum in London, probably first seen by Henry Moore, which catalogue you can see here on the left. And at the same time, the Cabinet de Mathématiques at Sorbonne, Paris, 1914, on the other image, brought non-Euclidean geometries to a surrealist and abstract artist as a new art frontier. This was really an opportunity to explore the structure and inner rules of objects and nature rather than just its form. Well, then our friend Man Ray appeared, and he photographs not all the models, but several models at the Poincaré Institute in Paris. And these photographs are on display in 1936 and in this fantastic number of the Carré des Arts magazine, l'objet, objet mathématique, objet naturel, objet sauvage, objet trouvé. In this article, the new art form which was going to put in contrast as well as the traditional apparatus that designed singing was still displayed at the time. This created a kind of a new brainstorm. You need to imagine that all these people were living more or less in Cambridge and London. Many of them, they went out from Germany due to the war or to the opposite ideas that Hitler had starting in 1933. And at the same time, the new branch of physics and crystallography, they were using X-rays to try to convey and discover the inner atoms of the matter. And these graphs of Bernal here, you can see the graphs, you can see the sculpture of Barbara Hepworth. So there was a kind of harmony between the ideas of finding the inner truths of nature in the science and the inner truths of art that the artists were seeking of. For constructivists, the creation of image in art had to be as pure as the mathematicians' formulae or engineer constructions. Art, like science, had to convey information about the nature of things, rather than simply transmit representations of it. And in 1920, Gabo, together with his brother Antoine Pevne, published the Realistic Manifesto, which strongly advocated a form of art that renounced volume and mass, as encountered in the classic tradition, proposing instead a new order based on the structural force of nature, such as gravity, velocity, space, and time. You can see here a work of Gabo and also a kind of a diagram representation of the atoms of the analysis of graphite, which was one of the breakthroughs that Desmond Bernal was doing at the Cavendish Laboratory in London. To conclude this part, if before we have looked briefly about the impact of the dawn of war in creating the conditions for a new attitude towards organized research, now with the exploration of topology and non-Euclidean geometries by artists and the will to look for the new paradigms of science in art, we can foresee that architects were in the midst of this new milieu. This image in Cambridge, it's Kittley's Art Gallery, which was designed and amplified by Leslie Martin, embodies very much this new spirit of the time. The gallery holds an exceptional collection of abstract, surrealist and constructive art, which patrons were Jim Eade, the director of the gallery, Maynard Keynes, the famous economist from Cambridge, Peggy Guggenheim, who played a very important role by then as well, Roland Penrose, Margaret Gardner, and Desmond Bernal. As I said before, our hypothesis is that the period of the pre-war and post-war in London and Cambridge was extremely fruitful for the collaboration between artists, architects, and scientists, where Leslie Martin received very much of an early research agenda laid out by Bernal and implemented with Lionel March at the Lane Building Farms Center Studies in Cambridge in 1967. Well, but the story goes on, and unfortunately the war really starts. In June 1941, the German army invades the Soviet Union, bringing the nation to the brink of collapse and demanding great sacrifice from the entire country. Leningrad was under siege for a cruel 800 days until the Soviet authority could arrange the city free from the Germans. This image from the photographer Victor Bulla, Pioneers in Defense Drill, Leningrad, illustrates citizens with gas masks ready for a gas attack. In the context of war and of social realism, Stalin's ambition to dominate all forms of intellectual expression and political ideology came to the forefront. To accomplish that, he also used music as a powerful art medium of political propaganda. One of the leading musical figures of the Soviet Union by then was Dmitry Shostakovich. Born and educated also in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Shostakovich's career lived the joy and painfulness of the Stalin authority. And his music was expressed with such power and passion, which also became a symbol of the Stalin regime against the Nazi oppressive invasion. This was much accomplished by his 7th symphony, also called the Leningrad Symphony, which was written in between bombing raids by the German. Shostakovich wrote a symphony that had an unprecedented success and stands as one of the war landmarks also in the USA, which precisely put him in the cover of Time magazine in 1942, just 1 week before the first performance by Arturo Toscanini in Chicago. But by this time, and probably not listening to Shostakovich at Bletchley Park Mansion, North London, it was the wartime headquarters for the Allies. The war effort produced advances in technology and logistics and communications. Allied code breakers were already working in secret at Bletchley Park Mansion, this is the photo, since 1939, trying to decrypt German war code machines, mainly the Enigma machine and the Lawrence machines. Intelligence produced shortened the war by 2 to 4 years, and without it, the outcome of the conflict would have been uncertain. As you know, among the first recruitments were Alan Turing and Gordon Welshman, both Cambridge mathematicians, becoming key figures in the technological development of the 20th century, where in 1936 Alan Turing's paper on computable numbers remained one of the most fundamental texts for the development of computing. So here I just put some cornerstones from 1936 till 1967, which were very important theoretical apparatus from Alan Turing in 1936, and you see 1 year later, 1937, Claude Shannon, the symbolic analysis of relay on switching sequence, and you're actually also allowed to the action protection of synapses on the brain. Then we have Pitt's Norbert Wiener and cybernetics. Once again, Turing, John von Neumann, John McCarthy in 1956 for artificial intelligence, the Dartmouth Conference, and later on synthetic structure by Noam Chomsky. At Bletchley Park, they managed to build 2 machines, each machines to break 2 different code breakers, one for Lawrence and another for Colossus. Here, Colossus was designed by Tommy Flowers, was an engineer at the telephone company, and Alan Turing. And the other computer, they called the bomb, designed also at Bletchley Park to find the key into the secret codes of Enigma, the German encrypted machine. This is a picture of the production of the Colossus. And between 1944 and 1962, different technologies advances in the realm of digital of circuits were used in the first computers. You can see how the size of the circuits shrink, going from vacuum tubes to different kind of technologies, allowing memory capacity to be bigger and machines to get slower. By the end of the war, all this technology started to become somehow popular, and Vannevar Bush wrote 2 articles, the first in the Atlantic Monthly, with the text "As We May Think," and later Time magazine writes a kind of a brief account of the developments of computer technology from the early days that he was doing his differential analyzer at MIT. It's still a kind of a science fiction possibility, but many ideas about even internet hypertext, which Nicholas Negroponte will repeat later in his book Being Digital, were already depicted in these texts. Giant Brains from Edmund Berkeley, or a more serious work, The Computer and the Brain by John von Neumann, were important texts since they were trying to reveal the possible architecture to implement in computing. In particular, the 1958 von Neumann book, The Computer and the Brain, is a published version of the lecture that he was not able to give because he was sick to give at Yale in 1956. This essay is structured into part discuss the computer by its procedures, control mechanisms, trying to understand information processing in the brain and its neural system. Von Neumann was one of the responsible to design the ENIAC computer at the Moore School of Electrical Engineering at the University of Pennsylvania. Nevertheless, the war effort in computing at some point came out of the lab. The secret was not necessary any longer, and the work that Turing did for Colossus went to the Ferranti Mark I computer in 1950. You can see Turing there standing up nearby the Ferranti computer, which became as well one of the first commercial computers outside, and Cambridge University bought the Ferranti Marco computer, which was also the computer that Lionel March, Philip Stedman worked in early 1967, still with punched cards. Of course, here we have a myriad of examples. Also, Claude Shannon computer, the digital computer 601, was an electromagnetic digital computer created and sold by Scientific Development Corporation as early as in 1961. But here then, once again, architects start to get the knowledge of all these potentials. And in 1964, after Yves Sunderland's Sketchpad, the first interactive CAD system, commercial companies were developing the first CAD packages, and discussion about the use of new technologies in urban planning, transportation, and economics matters were also taking place at the Joint Center for Urban Studies of Harvard and MIT. These and other premises about bringing computers and mathematics into the architecture and design were presented by then at the Conference on Architecture and Computer at the Boston Architectural Center. Interesting that Walter Gropius, by then 81 years old, Sergei Chermayev, and Christopher Alexander all met together among engineers and professors of economy, and Gropius sent a text called Computers for Architectural Design, and he said, some people scorn violently the idea that lifeless machines could be of any advantage to inventive thinking. Believe that by this attitude the berry is cast away with the wash. Also in 1968 at the ICA, the institute which was founded as well by Roland Penrose, the concept of using computers in the arts and in architecture started in a sympathetic social and political climate. Although the initial post-war World War period there were no computers available, there was a great wealth of conceptual thinking, as I was trying to lay out briefly. Informed by cybernetics, by Claude Shannon information theory, or even D.W. Thompson's book on growth and form at the early 1967. The cybernetics Redney exhibition, which poster is displayed here, run at ICA London, whose director was Jesse Weiser, and involved artists who either learned to program or build up a working relationship with engineers at a time when the computer itself was still at a formative stage. On the other side of the Atlantic, Nicholas Negroponte text Toward the Theory of Architecture Machines, which appeared in 1969, predicted the experimental use of computing, also very much informed by the notion of evolution and information theory based on McLuhan and Pitt's paper from 1933. Indeed, in 1970, Negroponte, with the Architectural Machine Group, organized a software exhibition curated by Jane Burnham for the Jewish Museum in New York. This piece consists of a plexiglass encased computer-controlled environment full of small blocks and inhabited by these little animals, gerbills, who continuously change the position of the blocks. Following instruction programmed by the authors, the robotic arm automatically rearranges the blocks in a specific pattern. So a kind of a feedback loop and memory testing the new positions that the animals were taking. The interesting thing here is that, for instance, so these machines are more or less the same, but the ideas and the conceptual framework is different. So Negroponte wants to do search about evolution and feedback theory, and on the other hand, in England, we're trying to use the computing in Cambridge to solve practical problems, to design hospitals or optimize floor plans, or using heuristics or stochastic calculations. So the approach is completely different. And if you look to UC Berkeley, where Christopher Alexander moved after being at Yale, so then the spectrum opens very much. And nowadays the schools still are rooted in this tradition, which I think it's like being global, being local. Although we now all of us use the same software, the programs that are posed are different. Like in Carnegie Mellon, for instance, the importance of Herbert Simon, Alan Newell with problem solving and artificial intelligence drove the path of computing in a different way. Like that. To conclude, architectural course. Am I too late? I'm okay? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. So let's go back to the fundamentals of this thing, and with the text that William Mitchell wrote in 1975. He called it Vitruvius Computatus. He said, there exists now an extensive body of theoretical and technical literature concerning CAD, computer-aided design, but it may be most usefully viewed as a direct continuation of the classical academic tradition of elementary composition. End of quote. Well, in Venice, wealth came from its overseas trade, and around 1500, the majority of the Venetian population was directly or indirectly connected with sea trade. Daniel Barbaro, a high-ranking cleric and son of a Venice aristocrat, is here represented in a painting by Paolo Veronese. Barbaro holds a copy of Vitruvius' book on his hand, which first translation into Italian was made by Barbaro himself. Nonetheless, published in 1556, Vitruvius' translation had the drawings by Andrea Palladio himself, whose architecture foremost represented the richness and the splendor of the mercantile aristocracy of Venice, and to whom Palladio designed a villa for Villa Barbaro. As you know, Palladio was very much inspired by the text of Alberti, Celio, before he wrote his famous The Four Books of Architecture. Interestingly, this copy of Il Quattro Libri di Architettura de Palladio has annotations by this one here, as annotations by Inigo Jones. It was taken around Italy by Jones on his trip with Lord Arundel in 1613 and 1614. Rudolf Wittcauer, who wrote, as you know, Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, studied drawings of Inigo Jones, and Colin Rowe, who was also a student of Rudolf Wittcauer in London, took the argument further for his important essay, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, published for the first time in 1947. So this is the copy of the essay, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, which, by comparing the structure and space of Villa Malcontenta by Andrea Palladio with Villa Gart from Corbusier, Colin Rowe opened the theoretical discourse apart from historical perspective to a descriptive and analog one, where architectural elements were perceived as parts from a larger compositional system. This was an extremely interesting idea that was used by Peter Eisenman. As you know, he did his PhD thesis under the supervision of Leslie Martin. That was, in fact, Colin Rowe who most inspired Leslie Martin. Leslie Martin who was inspired by Peter Eisenman. And Peter Eisenman did the trip to Italy with Colin Rowe, the same that Wittcauer did for Inigo Jones, visiting many of these Renaissance buildings. Eisenman's thesis, The Formal Base of Modern Architecture, and Notes on Conceptual Architecture, draws also influence as well from the drawings variations with cubes that the artist Saul Lewitt did, and that's the drawing above. So in this context, we can understand how easy it was, we hope, for George Stanley and William Mitchell to write the Palladian grammar in 1978. Here, Villa Malcontenta was drawn by Andrea Palladio in the Quattro Libri. This paper, the Palladian grammar, as you know, is one of the first presenting the developments of grammars from existing corpus of design, illustrating the possibility of the emergence of form within a particular set of design rules. So the computation was done by hand, the inference of the rules was made by existing corpus of design, but the computational implementation was not done in 1978, but a few years later by Krishnamurti, Chris Eld, and John Gill, etc. So to summarize, and not to leave everything on the air, and for those who would like to do some research on this, I just put here a few centers where all these things were happening. So I spoke about the Harvard and MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies in 1959. Alexander was here. The Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, founded by Marilyn Delzonis, Peter Eisenman, and Kenneth Frampton, was a very, very important intellectual hub related to Princeton and Columbia, and also the Frankfurt School, the Land Use and Performance Studies in Cambridge, the Architecture Machine Group, the Design Research Center Carnegie Mellon, the Open University. Then we have to put UCLA, Berkeley, Sydney as well, but I will get to you as well. This is the copy of the PhD proposal of Alexander in 1958, supervised by Chermayev, and later gave rise to his book Notes on Cities of Form. Some drawings, or digital drawings, did by Lionel March, applying the concept of silver art and polymaths for the geometry of elementary architectural forms. The first reports of 1967 of the Language and Built Form Studies, which are very interesting reports and depict all the research that was doing already with computers by then. A letter from Shakistin to Lionel March in 1971, trying to establish a bridge between both universities. And finally, outside in 1971, we started to have a kind of recognition from the stakeholders, architectural design and real publications. On one hand, we have Geometry of the Environment, which is a very solid book with research about the city and the relation between form and mathematics. And on the other hand, kind of a collection of articles from some of these research that I spoke already. Last but not least, the Center for Configural Studies shows also this report, the work by Philip Stedman, Krishna Krishnamurti, William Mitchell, really the foundations of many exercises and implementations of these early ideas. To conclude, and I'm quoting Leslie Martin in the preface of the book, if mathematics is sought as a logical pattern of entities and relationships, then this may be perhaps be seen to reflect in the physical and spatial arrangement of buildings. To recognize and cultivate this relationship is to deepen and stimulate a whole area of thought about architecture. We become aware of another way of looking at a design problem, and I think this will be also the answer to the question that lady asked before. Mathematics and computation is just a different lens that we use to see the world. Does it mean that we're going to change the lens? We just use it when it is needed, and we need to work with it. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you very much for a fascinating and educational talk. You covered an amazing range, I think, in a very interesting way. Do I need this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Amazing. I thought you might be interested to know that there is a direct link between Alan Turing and Lionel March that most people don't know. I don't know if you know this. So this is not new to you. But Lionel March got to Cambridge in a very unexpected way. You have to know a little bit about the British system of class. Lionel March's parents were servants. One worked as a cook and the other as a gardener for a private high school. And because of that, Lionel March was allowed to go to that school. Otherwise, he would never have been able to go to a school like that. And it turned out he did something interesting in a mathematics exercise, which his teacher sent to a friend of his at another university, who said, look, this looks very interesting. And he sent it on to Alan Turing, who also thought it was interesting, that's all he said, and wrote back through this chain of people that this person should try and do something. In Britain, a person from the lower class could never get to Cambridge. And when he was told to apply, he said it's a waste of time. And then again, through this chain, Alan Turing wrote to Cambridge and said, look, this guy is smart, let him in. And that's how Lionel March started becoming what he became.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is more like a comment than
Yes, that's not a
question. Yes.
So, any other questions? No questions? Okay. Okay, there's one question over there.
Hi, Dermot McNeil from the University of Auckland. From listening to your talk, it seems that sort of luck and chance, serendipity played a part in all these people being together in the right place at the right time. Do you think that's a fair comment on what you've discovered in your research?
Do you agree with that comment of mine that they were on the right place on the right time?
Yes, yes. I mean, is that, do you think that's central in some ways to it?
Yeah, for the period of the early 30s, I think it is. I'm trying to emphasize that, but I think it's really, I think it is and very centered on the figure of Leslie Martin, indeed.
Well, what about I suppose our contemporary situation? There seems to be a lot of siloing and disciplines being reinforced in their disciplines for various reasons. Do you think the opportunity for that is reduced now, or do you think it's increased?
Yes, well, the whole, once again, the 1930s period, the whole enterprise, which there is not very much research there, it was a kind of open door to everything. There were exhibitions of work of the architects from the Bauhaus in the city gallery. There were exhibitions of the students of the Gropius and Breuer at university. And there were discussions and symposiums like that, that one bringing economics in, bringing professor of economy, professor of civil engineering, professor of architecture, and we've been playing together. I think it was a kind of a boost of ideas. And they went there. I mean, and the idea was from Leslie Martin. He was the person who was trying to make this kind of a global brainstorming. Also because his father was an architect, and he was rejecting very much the older forms of architecture, and he was not even very keen in seeing, modernism per se in the way of the Corbusier as the solution for England. He was very much intrigued by the inner rules. I mean, there is the land, there is the urbanism, there is a problem, there is a solution. In a very, very systematic way, I think. And that's why he needed different disciplines and different professionals to work on that. He didn't want to import or even to adapt a kind of carte latine into England by one hand. That's one thing. The other thing is the ideological and political environment. I mean, these guys, particularly the scientists, they call the left wing, they were very much rejecting the fear of what was happening in Spain. Spain was a terrible thing. It was a terrible thing. Mussolini in Ethiopia first, in Abyssinia, then Mussolini was in Morocco. He travels from the Gibraltar Strait into Spain, and he just the German fighters came. It was a kind of a bloodshed, and I believe the left scientists were very much concerned with this, since the politicians were not. There was this kind of agreement that they were not, England and France, they would not want to intervene in the conflict in Spain. And picking on John Gio's words, low class was not going to university, so Cambridge was a real hype situation. So you can imagine, between Trinity College and Churchill College and London, these guys were all together. Of course, maybe this was happening in different circles for other disciplines. Then there is the love circuit and the Bloomsbury group in Virginia Woolf, for instance. Maynard Keynes was this famous economist in Cambridge. He had probably the best collection of art in the UK by then, and the advisor for his purchase of works of art was the brother of Virginia Woolf. So, I mean, they were together and they were discussing these things. And I think Leslie Martin was aware of this and kept a very organized pace of change. And if you think, one of the major buildings which were built in London after the war is on the South Bank for the 1951 the South Bank, the Festival of England is precisely the Royal Festival Hall, right? This huge concert hall, and who designed this? Leslie Martin. So I think he was a political guy, a very interesting, he was aware of things, and that's my interpretation of it. I don't know if I answered fully to your question.
There's a question by Pedro Veloso over there.
Hello, I would like to, your thesis has produced a very interesting map of the generation, the first generation of computational design, at least the research that was being made during the 60s. And I'm curious about is that recently there was a book of MIT called The Second Modernism, and telling the history of research at MIT from the same period. And I would like, and at the same time, your research points that there is a branch of modernism that's connected to Cambridge and that's connected to the education in the United States. And at some point, you show some connections also between Peter Eisenman to Cambridge, because he goes to as a graduate student, he goes there with the people from Lionel March, I think. And I would like you to describe how do you understand the identity of this generation of the 60s that was doing some computational design research? Do you think that, is it possible to describe as a second modernism? Is it related somehow to postmodernism? And in the 70s, that's going to be also the connections with like Negroponte, with the counterculture and other phenomena. So I would like to understand, how do you see the identity of this generation of the 60s? Is there possible to describe as with a name, or is it possible to, as a historian, how do you see that generation?
That's a multi-layer answer. I think these guys were so powerful, and they were so sure about the research they were doing, that they were able to do a kind of a sea storm in the place they were. They were connected, but they were not connected at all. If you see, Alexander worked very much alone. Christopher Alexander, okay? He was an Austrian mathematician. He went to Cambridge. And the work that he did, and also the work that he did, differs from the first city pattern then to know some synthesis of form. We cannot see Alexander related to other artistic architectural movements. I think there is first, if there is a kind of a common ground among these guys, is that the critical reading of the situation. And I think this is very important. And that's what's not happening nowadays. But nowadays it's very difficult. I mean, nowadays I speak from the last 10 years. Everything is so fast that we don't have time to have a critical apparatus, probably. But by then they were very critical about the situation, the architectural situation and the political situation. They knew what they didn't want to do. Both, all of them. Alexander, Colin Rowe, Peter Eisenman, Lionel Marsh, Leslie Martin, and that's a common ground. Then if you want to follow the ideas and the people, you will find a kind of a exponential network. Alexander goes to Harvard, then he goes to Yale, then he goes to Berkeley. Peter Eisenman is a kind of enfant terrible, and he still is an enfant terrible. Peter Eisenman came from Cornell to Cambridge with a Fulbright scholarship, and he's a very bright. Everyone here is very intelligent. It's amazing. When you read these texts, they are so good. You cannot even change a word probably of any of them. But for instance, Peter Eisenman is an architect. He comes from Cornell to Cambridge. he didn't know what to do, but when he finds Colin Rowe and he goes traveling through Italy in 1963 for, I believe, 2 months, he understands what he wants to do, and he understands what he wants to do when he sees Giuseppe Terragni fascist house in Lago di Como. So if you think about Terragni's architecture, and you think about the work of Palladio, and then if you take the Solowitz's Notes on Conceptual Form, which is the text that appears in Art Form in 1963 from Solowitz, Peter Eisenman just put these things together. The rules of Palladio, the knowledge of Rodolph Witkauer, the strengths of the material from Terragni, and then the conceptual art from Solowitz. And then he produced his PhD with Leslie Martin, but Leslie Martin I don't think was very important. And then he runs into New York, and he does this melting tank, the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, where almost everything could happen in a certain way. So these are two people, and you can follow other ones. There's also the importance of the music of Steve Reich and Ludwig Wittgenstein that we didn't speak yet. But from the Vienna philosophical, the second school of philosophy in Vienna, Wittgenstein and Rudolf Carnap and logical positivism is a very important current that goes to Chicago and later on to the work that Chuck Easton was doing there. But Peter Eisenman also picks up on the Stephen Reich and serial music to his work. And Wittgenstein also did a thesis in Cornell. If you don't know, Wittgenstein wrote about Stephen Reich because the brother of Wittgenstein was a musician. So in a certain way, to do it short, they knew they had a very critical reading of the architecture, moment. And it's a critical moment because postmodernism, right? And I think they were a little bit, of course we have two trends here. You have structuralism and post-structuralism, and we know the importance of the writings of Roland Barthes, Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault. And I think these architects somehow were rejecting this possibility. Others were not, because this gave rise to the constructivist architecture, which was, of course, a very intellectual, interesting apparatus and momentum.